This is a shiur discussing the issue of Nihum Avelim, of consoling mourners on Shabbat, and I'm offering this in commemoration of the Shloshim, the 30-day period from the funeral for my father, Melvin Gradofsky. I'd like to welcome, to the extent that technology has worked out, my mother, Lillian, and my sister, Miranda, who should be watching, and if not, they'll be watching by video later. So I want to acknowledge their presence either currently or in the future. With that, let me, before I get into any substance, just welcome people. If they have questions or comments either here or online, please feel free to jump in with them. I'm not going to give too much of a biography of my father. Those who are interested, footnote 1 in the sources has a link to the funeral that can be watched, or you can read the text of the eulogies to learn more about my father. But one thing that was something that was very strong in my father, and certainly I inherited, is the joy of discussion and debate. And my father loved to discuss things with people, to either agree with them or disagree with them, or a little bit of both. And so please don't stand on ceremony, and if you have comments, disagreements in how I'm looking at the text or anything else, please don't be either shy or too forgiving. Our responsibility is first and foremost to get the best understanding we can get of our Torah and of the guidance of our sages. So with that, the main reason why I started this study, and I actually did most of this study about 2 years ago, and got around to wrapping it up here, is that there is a common misconception that people have, that Nihum Avelim, that consoling mourners, is generally not permitted on Shabbat. And as we'll see, that's not really the case, although there are certainly some traditions that were out there and different practices out there, but we'll see the sources on that. It goes without saying that when we talk about a subject like this, we need to look both with sensitivity toward the text and with sensitivity toward the people that we are talking about, and people who have suffered a loss, and their needs, and how to best take care of them. And therefore, I issue the proviso that while I have spent a lot of time on the text and have some practical experience, both as a clergy person and as someone who has suffered a loss, I am not a expert in mental health, and therefore I really look forward to hearing from people about their reflections based on personal experience, either professionally or personally, and how that might bring further light to what we're discussing. With that, let's take a look at the first source, which should appear on page 2, which is from the Babylonian Talmud. And I'm not going to be reading through all the text and all the sources that I have here because we don't have that kind of time. And I'll try to give you an idea of where I'm going. For this text, we're going to go to the words that are kind of bolded and underlined, in which case we see the words, V'ein menachamim avelim, v'ein mevakirin cholin b'shabbat, divrei Beit Shammai, u'Beit Hillel matirin. So we don't console mourners or visit the sick on Shabbat, according to the Academy of Shammai, but Beit Hillel permits such acts, which, of course, as a general rule, you could almost turn yourself there and know that the halacha should be that we do, in fact, do these things on Shabbat, because by and large, the halacha follows Beit Hillel. We have a very interesting note at the very end of this little piece. The Amar Rabbi Chanina, Bekoshi hitiru lenachem avelim v'liv kor cholim b'Shabbat. That Rabbi Chanina tells us that it was with difficulty that the rabbis permitted the consoling of mourners and visiting of the sick on Shabbat. And so we may discuss over time a little bit about why that was a difficult decision, although the text here doesn't tell us exactly what the difficulty was, but we'll go into that a little bit further. At the bottom of page 2, you have a source from the Talmud Yerushalmi, which seems to give a different perspective on the halacha. Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi b'shem Rabbi Hanina. Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, "Halo ameru ein avel b'Shabbat." Didn't the sages teach that there is no mourning on Shabbat? Mipnei ma ameru leharot lo panim, lo mipnei hakavod. So why is it that they said nonetheless that you can be leharot panim, which literally means to show face and probably means along the lines of to pay respects on Shabbat, mipnei hakavod, out of respect for the person who has suffered the loss, we can do this leharot panim. Now, the consensus seems to be that this larot panim that the Yerushalmi is talking about is distinctly different from formal Nihum Avelim, meaning that you show up and you're there, but you don't necessarily say anything about the loss or something along those lines. And I have a couple of commentaries here on page 3 that reflect that. I want to pick up from the Alei Tamar commentary, where he first points out that this seems to be the case that the Yerushalmi has a bit of a different opinion than the Bavli. He says that this larot panim means not quite, that you're there to show empathy for the person, but you don't do formal Nihum Avelim. And at the end of kind of what is the first paragraph and the way I've set up the text, he says, Ulam ein kein da'at ha-Bavli b'Shabbat. But this isn't the opinion of the Babylonian Talmud on Shabbat, says Alei Tamar, because we've already seen that the Bavli tells us that according to Beit Hillel, we do Nihum Avelim on Shabbat. And he goes on to tell us, Uraiti b'shelet utshuvot yachin uvoaz. I saw in this certain text of responsa literature, which goes back to the 15th century, where they're just talking about this. I'm going to go to the third line of the second paragraph. Sheminhag kanmoni be Constantinople, that in Constantinople, that the practice was she'ein lenachem lo b'Shabbat velo beregel, that the practice was not to console either on Shabbat or a holiday. Aval nahogu le'shev imo b'bayit lehakel me'alav b'yeshiva velo dafka velo b'nechama. But they would go and they would sit with the person in order to ease his trouble, but particularly not with actual consoling of the mourner.
Anyway, because the Chag stops the morning.
So that's an interesting point, and I don't know what the practice was in Constantinople in about that, and because there are many different interpretations of how Yontif works for a loss, and it might be that here what they're saying is, I'm concentrating mostly on Shabbat, but on Yom Tov they might be saying, yeah, Shiva might be formally over, but you could still go visit, and quite possibly we might say you could also do formal consolation as well, I would think.
Now, who is this?
Okay, so on most of my texts, you will see a footnote that tells you Rabbi Yitzchak ben... I'm on the wrong line. Rabbi Tzemach Duran, Algiers, 15th century, and actually Alei Tamar split into two parts, and it was two brothers who wrote the different parts of that. Yes.
So was that counted as Shiva?
You know what? I'm not sure. I don't want to get too far into that issue here, but it seems like it wasn't at least formal Shiva, but it was kind of people would come visit, so to speak. Yeah.
I was actually going to say something similar. Is this necessarily talking about during the 7 days of Shiva, or could it even be during Shloshim or before Shiva in the case of
it sounds like it's that like it is Shiva, and I read the response, but I don't remember if it made enough of those details clear. But so what we see here is the practice in Constantinople was people were visiting, but not quite saying, not quite doing formal nechama. But what we see is, and these are kind of between the two ellipses in that middle paragraph. V'hagon Rabbi Tzemach, the writer of the responsum, cholek alav Nihum Avelim. He disagreed with this practice based on the Bavli, and says Alei Tamar, Ulam yadua shebe Constantinople uvechol malchut Byzance malchut Romi b'Mizrach min hagehem haya al pi haYerushalmi. And I won't translate directly, but basically that we know, he says, that in Constantinople, a lot of the practices reflected the practices of the Talmud Yerushalmi. And he goes on to, in the next paragraph that we won't read together, to kind of describe a text that we'll read a little bit more together, that there's two different versions of about certain forms of practice for consoling mourners that would happen in the temple, and one version that he says seems to suggest words of nechama being spoken, and one that doesn't mention words of nechama being spoken, and he suspects that those two texts from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer and from Masechet Sofrim maybe have a similar difference of opinion on whether or not you say actual words of nechama. And picking up on what, at least in my printing, is page 4, like the last couple of lines of that first paragraph. Ulefichach nireh she'af bizman beit hamikdash hayu chalukim hadeot bazeh. So he says it appears that even at the time of the temple, there were debates on whether or not you said words of consolation. And he says, and even we saw Rabbi Hanina in the Talmud Bavli saying that it was with great difficulty that the sages permitted saying words of nechama on Shabbat. So what Alei Tamar is suggesting is that there really were different practices out there that are reflected in the difference between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and in the differences between these other minor tractates. Ultimately, that the halacha, if following the Talmud Bavli and Beit Hillel, is to permit, but it seems like different customs continued to exist on that point. So let's move forward a little bit. I note that Alei Tamar, in the last paragraph that we're going to skip, he kind of musters up as much proof as he can to try to demonstrate that when the Yerushalmi says that we do leharot panim on Shabbat, that he tries to muster as much proof that demonstrates that this is not formal nechama, not formal words of consolation. I think his arguments are fairly convincing, and he has a lot of, and most of the reads of the Yerushalmi agree that there is this difference between Bavli and Yerushalmi, but his proofs are less than ironclad. And the next little interesting on a number of levels from Rabbi, I think suggests maybe that Rabbi did not see a difference between Bavli and Yerushalmi. Yes?
The conflation of visiting the sick and consoling the mourner, is there anything about that that is oneness behind that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think you're right that those two issues are... They're qualitatively different, certainly. All of the discussion comes out of this one piece of Talmud Bavli that started with Beit Shammai telling us that you're not allowed to do either visiting the sick or consoling mourners, and in turn Beit Hillel disagreeing. So they're treated similarly, and probably for similar reasons. There might be some technical differences, but ultimately, and we'll see this a little bit more, they are things that can serve for the person who's doing the visiting, who's doing the consoling, that can detract from their enjoyment of Shabbat in different ways. And there might be some other technical issues towards that, but I think they're both the idea that they're not necessarily that they may detract from a person's enjoyment of Shabbat on Shabbat one way or another. And another page we'll see a couple of discussions on that. But yeah, I think they are very much related, although there may be some reasons to make some differences at times. So on page 5, we have the text of Ritba, which is kind of a very by-the-by comment, but very interesting on a number of levels. He's dealing with a halacha that is about what happens in the last day of Shiva. On the 7th day of Shiva, the rule is miktzat hayom kekulo, that observing part of that day of Shiva is as if you observed the whole day of Shiva. And so usually, and as presented in the Talmud Bavli, it is once the people who console the person leave on that last day, that's when Shiva ends. And usually, practically, what happens is the morning minyan, if there's a morning minyan in the Shiva home, will come. Everyone will daven, they'll wish consolation to the mourners. And when everyone leaves from the morning minyan, that's usually when Shiva ends. So what Ritba is dealing with is the question of what if the 7th day of Shiva falls out on Shabbat. And there are lots of different opinions out here, and I think Ritba's opinion is very interesting, but there's many more lenient opinions. I have one opinion in the footnote about that. But I just want to see what Ritba says on this, and it's about, I'm going to pick up 5 lines down in the Ritba text. He says, Ubiyom HaShabbat Leika Minachamim. And on Shabbat, there are no consolers. There's no visitors coming to make consolation. And he says, V'isura nami hu la'asot ken befarhesia. We'll take this up later, but he says, and it would even be forbidden to have public consolation of mourners on Shabbat. As I said, we'll take that up later. And he mentions, Uvekoshi hitiru liyachid larot panim b'Shabbat. And he says, and it was with difficulty that the sages allowed individuals to pay their respects, larot panim, on Shabbat. So there are a couple of things I think are very interesting here. And he goes on to say, basically, since there are no visitors on Shabbat, visitors never leave on Shabbat, and therefore the person can't cut off their Shiva earlier in the day on Shabbat. It's a very interesting opinion and different than most practices, but we'll leave it at that. What I'm interested in is a couple of things. So he says that, first of all, he mentions that it seems by him people aren't consoling mourners on Shabbat, so that they're not in the home to leave the home to let the person get up. And further, that he mentions that it was with difficulty that the sages allowed larot panim, which is using the language that we saw in the Yerushalmi about on Shabbat we do this larot panim, but mentioning the difficulty of the permission that we saw in the Bavli. So it's possible that Ritba is reading the Yerushalmi in the same way as the Bavli, and maybe therefore either saying that the Bavli doesn't allow saying anything, or that the Yerushalmi does allow saying things, and that maybe there isn't a conflict between the two. So it's a very interesting comment altogether. But coming down to, again, we see an indication of a permission to do at least individual Nihum Avelim, but it seems also he mentions that people aren't doing that in general. So the halacha, as we mentioned, based on the Bavli, would be that we'd permit Nihum Avelim on Shabbat. And you'll see on page 6, we won't read inside, I have a very quick quote from Rambam's Mishneh Torah and from Shulchan Aruch that say exactly that it is permissible to do Nihum Avelim on Shabbat. Then we have a very interesting comment by the Magen Avraham, commenting on the Shulchan Aruch, who reminds us that the permission to do Nihum Avelim on Shabbat was given begrudgingly, and therefore he says, Udelo, this is toward the end of that little piece, Udelo ka'otan shekol yemot hashavua ein holechin rak b'Shabbat. So he complains about those people who aren't going on during the rest of the week, and they're going on Shabbat. In context, it is not clear to me whether he means, it means clearly some people are saying, I'm busy during the week, I'll go on Shabbat. It's not clear whether he means that apropos of visiting the sick or consoling the mourners or both. So I'm not really sure how that comes down, but it's I think a very interesting point that even if we discuss the permissibility of doing Nihum Avelim and Shabbat in different ways, that we wouldn't want that to make people figure out, I can talk to the person on Shabbat, so I won't go during the week or something like that. And Magen Avraham seems to be struggling with that, possibly just about Bikur Cholim. Maybe it was that people were taking their time to go visit the sick only on Shabbat. But either way, the point is we don't want to say that these very important mitzvot should be relegated to being done only on Shabbat. And in Be'ur Halacha, the author of the Mishnah Berurah talks about as long as you're going during the rest of the week to do these things, whatever it is, that whether it's Bikur Cholim or Nihum Avelim, you can do it on Shabbat too, just don't leave it. The point is don't leave it to Shabbat, and that's what Magen Avraham was talking about. In the next paragraph, I kind of very briefly describe some texts that we're going to see in the future with a little bit more detail on some kind of side issues that interest me. But we see, for instance, the Aruch HaShulchan, when he's talking about exactly what to say to a mourner on Shabbat, whether the standard things that we say to a mourner should be said on Shabbat, he kind of presents the issues that we'll present later, and then he closes by saying, Ve'etzleinu lo nahagu b'nichum avelim b'Shabbat. By us, we have not practiced to do consoling of mourners on Shabbat. And it's not clear to me what he means there. He might mean we don't say any of the words. He might mean that we don't visit either, or that maybe we do gestures of Nihum Avelim, but we don't say anything. It's not entirely clear, but clearly he's telling us there's something that people were kind of holding back on Nihum Avelim in his community. And I think it's at the very least that people weren't saying words of nechama, but possibly also just generally visiting, etc. Similarly, Gesher HaChaim, when he's talking about the practice that the practices have changed, and I'm not going to get into details now, but it's a common practice to offer some form of nechama to mourners as they enter into the shul during Kabbalat Shabbat, right before we say Mizmor Shir L'Yom HaShabbat, the Psalm for Shabbat, Psalm 92. And he explains the practice as he knew it by saying, Shebekabbalat Shabbat paseka avelut defar hesya vehanichum. He says, because on Shabbat, public mourning has ended, and as well as consolation. And again, not entirely clear to me whether he means that all forms of consolation are cut off on Shabbat, or does he just mean that public forms of consolation on Shabbat are cut off, and which would be along the lines of what we saw Ritba saying earlier. And we'll take up the issue altogether later, but it's again at least clearly indicating that there was some difference in what was going on as far as Nihum Avelim on Shabbat. Gesher Chaim at another point talks about how Sephardim are accustomed to go to the house of mourning even on Shabbat, and that Ashkenazim are not accustomed to go to the house of mourning on Shabbat or Yom Tov, which means maybe all he's saying is that people aren't visiting, but not that you can't say anything at all. And interestingly, so Shmirat Shabbat Kehalchata also kind of quotes the Aruch HaShulchan and Gesher Chaim and briefs what they say, saying, "Umikol makom ein nohagin hayom lalechet b'Shabbat el ha'avel kedei lenachamo." That it's not customary to go to, probably meaning to go to the home of the person on Shabbat to offer consolation. Mishnah Brura, on the other hand, is crystal clear when he's talking about not having public acts of consoling mourners on Shabbat. He says, "Umikol makom lelech be'atzmo lomar Shabbat hi milenachem v'chulei rashai." He says, nonetheless, for one to go over to a person who's bereaved and say Shabbat hi milenachem, so the Sabbath prevents us from consoling. We'll discuss that phrase further later, but that this is that it is permitted. So clearly, the Mishnah Brura is saying that it is okay to go over to a person who's in mourning and to acknowledge their loss in some way on Shabbat. Yes?
The welcoming of the mourner on Shabbat, is that perhaps to present that, and that would be the end of being able to go any further?
Well, that's what Gesher Chaim seems to be suggesting, that doing that right as people are welcome on Shabbat was to tell people that we wouldn't do this on Shabbat. Exactly, is the public nature of the consolation, or just any consolation at all? I'm not exactly certain. Frankly, to the extent that was the communication, to me, that's a bug, not a feature, because I feel strongly that as we've seen, Nihum Avelim is permitted on Shabbat. So I wonder if some people, because they have seen the practice of mourners being welcomed right before the formal Kabbalat Shabbat of Psalm 92, that maybe people got the idea from that, or it may have reinforced some customs that were already out there but were at variance with the Babylonian Talmud and Beit Hillel, to give people the idea that so this practice of welcoming them might have sent a signal that was perhaps not great as to what was permitted on Shabbat. So we started discussing a little bit before. So what is the concern in the first place with Nihum Avelim, with consoling mourners on Shabbat? And so we'll look at a couple of texts that discuss that, beginning with the work of the Shi'iltot. The Shi'iltot is probably the earliest halachic compendium post-Talmud. It is a compendium that's kind of based on the Torah portions of the year, and the author basically sets up a certain halacha that comes up from the Torah portion. He gives you a bunch of the rules, and then at some point says, Beram tzarich. However, here's a question. Here's a halachic question about this particular area of law, and he explains the question, and then either at length or more quickly gives the answer to the question. So it happens that he presents the question of, do we do Nihum Avelim and Bikor Cholim on Shabbat? And his explanation of the question tells us what he thinks is the issue about all this. So he says, Beram tzarich b'Shabbat mahu l'shayule b'ketzira. So on Shabbat, what is the halacha regarding inquiring into the well-being of the afflicted, meaning someone who has suffered a loss or who is ill? Mi amrinan, keven de'azil v'chaziyele di'itle tza'ara chalash da'ate v'ka'akar inuga to Shabbat. Are we going to say that, well, if he's going to go see this person, and he'll see the trouble that this person is in, he'll see this person's anguish, that he too will begin to be troubled by this person's troubles? V'rachmana amar v'karata leShabbat oneg. But the Torah teaches us, or actually in Isaiah, that you should call the Sabbath a pleasure. So we have this rule of oneg Shabbat. We want to make Shabbat pleasurable. And so perhaps we're going to say to go visit someone who is in mourning or who is sick might make us feel bad on Shabbat and be inconsistent with our goal of oneg Shabbat. O Dilma, or perhaps the Shiltot says, Kevan de Amar Mar, because the master has said, Kol man de azil umashil beketzira, dame kaman de yahiv lechaye. So, anyone who goes and asks of a person who is afflicted, it's like he has brought him life, or he's saved his life. V'hilkach shapir dame. So he says, and therefore it's fine. So according to the Shiltot, the question of should we do this kind of visiting of the sick or consoling mourners on Shabbat is, do we say that since it's going to make us feel bad, it's going to detract from our Shabbat and therefore we shouldn't do it? Or do we say since it's so important to the person who is in need, potentially even life-saving, it is okay? Now, he just goes on and says, and then go see the Gemara says, Beit Hillel says it's permissible. Yes?
It makes me wonder whether you could extend this and say that one should avoid negative people on Shabbat.
One might, but don't worry, I'll still talk to you.
I was thinking of myself.
I'm distracted that from the beginning of the argument, Nihum Avelim and Bikur Cholim is being put in the same bucket. In that, in Bamim Madlikin, when we're talking about, we are allowed to turn off the lights if it bothers the sick. I mean, the comfort of the sick is so important that to put them in the same bucket is just.
I think I'm going to disagree with you because I think the comforting of the bereaved is also an extremely important value as well. So I think they do belong on the same place. Now, it so happens the average bereaved person you're not going to need to turn off the lights for the same way that maybe someone who's sick. But I think that the idea that caring for such people is very similar. It's not the exact same. So, for instance, he talks about saving a life. That's probably more directly applicable to visiting the sick. But it is, I think, ultimately what Shiltot is setting up is are we going to worry about how we feel, or are we going to worry about how this person feels and how we might provide aid in that?
The person is supposed to get value out of the fact that they have what to offer. There's a pleasure in giving to another person. So, your discomfort should be, in many cases, overridden by this particular pleasure.
Amen. That's all I have to say on the subject. Well said. And that arguably could be part of the counter argument to why we would permit these acts, because hopefully, there is something meaningful to us as well from that experience and from our ability to help people in their times of need. So I just agree. On page 8, I have a couple of other texts. I'm going to not read them directly, but Rabbeinu Hananel, the Rabbi Afasi, they talk about concern also about not wanting to cry out on Shabbat. We don't do like plaintive prayer on Shabbat, and that visiting a sick person or someone who's bereaved might lead us to doing such things. That's why, for instance, in a part of the Gemara that we skipped, but we'll get back to, it talks about saying to a person, Shabbat hi mi lizok, which you remember from the Mishabach prayer. That's what they would say. Listen, if I was here any other day, I'd be crying out to God on your behalf, but Shabbat hi mi lizok. I can't do that kind of crying out on Shabbat, unless, of course, it was a very emergent illness. So there's that idea. There's also Rashi mentions simply when he talks about, for instance, the comment of Rabbi Chanina that the permission to console and to visit on Shabbat was given with difficulty. Rashi just says mipnei hatzar, because of the anguish that it causes to the person who is visiting. That's why it was up in the air a little bit. So, I mean, there might be the technicality of the crying out, but ultimately, why shouldn't you cry out on Shabbat? Because that also detracts from Shabbat. Why shouldn't you have tsa'ar on Shabbat? Because it detracts from Shabbat. So there's a general consensus that the reason for the concern was that we might detract from our enjoyment of Shabbat by doing these things. Yeah.
So I don't want to hold things up, so you can stop me whenever you want. But there's a Shibboleth leket that's quoted by the Beit Yosef, where the students of Rabbi Akiva come across him. They find he's crying on Shabbat. He said, Rebbe, you taught us we're supposed to have Oneg Shabbos. And in his tears, he says, "This is my Oneg Shabbos." So it's not in our copies, our versions of Shibboleth Leket.
Okay.
But the Beit Yosef quotes it, and it would sort of overturn all of these concerns.
Interesting. So I'm not going to, I spent way too much time to overturn everything in one sentence. So we'll leave it there. So again, there's this idea of wanting to avoid detracting from enjoyment of Shabbat. What I find interesting, like all of these concerns are about the visitor. Okay? But, it's about what is it going to do for a person who does the visit, who does the Nihum Avelim. But we shouldn't for a minute take that to mean that was the primary concern, because ultimately the halacha is to permit these things because of the therapeutic effect for the mourner. And I think I'm going to run through the next page quickly. Aruch HaShulchan talks about that Beit Hillel allows visiting the sick ultimately because it is gemilut chasadim. It's bestowing of kindness on people, and we allow that. There's an absolutely beautiful, I'm sorry, I think I need to run through it, but this Tzitz Eliezer here is really quite beautiful, where he talks about, he's actually arguing against the Sharei Tshuva, who says that if a person is particularly sensitive and it's really going to cause them anguish to visit the sick, then that person shouldn't do such things on Shabbat. To which the Tzitz Eliezer says, what are you talking about? The whole point is that we override any concern for this tsar for a person to visit. And he just very beautifully talks about that even for someone who experiences personal pain, it's such a great mitzvah to visit that it is permitted. He quotes a Levush who certainly similarly talks about visiting a mourner in the same idea. And very interestingly, at the end of the Tzitz Eliezer, he argues, when Rabbi Chanina said that the permission to console mourners and visit the sick was given begrudgingly, with difficulty, he says ignore that. That's not the halacha. The halacha is plain and simple. Beit Hillel permits you to do these things. And it's not at all begrudging. And it's a very, very interesting read. He says, why assume this individual opinion kind of frames Beit Hillel? Beit Hillel just said, go do it. I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced one way or another as to whether we should take Rabbi Chanina's word for it. I will say, and I'm sorry I'm skipping over this, is just a really beautiful, gorgeous text, and if you have the chance to read through it on your own, I really encourage that. But what I would say is, I'm not sure it ultimately matters whether we agree with Rabbi Chanina, because if the Tzitz Eliezer is right, that the rabbis were gung-ho about visiting people and consoling mourners on Shabbat, then great, we can be gung-ho about it. If you tell me the rabbis really struggled with it, but ultimately they came to the conclusion, this is the more important value, then, again, great, we should do it because it's a very important, meaningful, and valuable thing to do. So, on a certain level, I don't think it really matters how begrudging the permission was, as long as the permission was granted. Yeah.
No, but the alternative would be that the Jewish community, they see somebody who is in their greatest moment of need, and the response is to leave them completely isolated and have no contact with them whatsoever. And the idea that was ever held up as a good possibility or even the better possibility of how to respond to that kind of situation is, I find it very disturbing.
I agree with you. I'm disturbed with it similarly. Let's keep in mind that was Beit Shammai's opinion. I talked to my teacher, Isaac Sassoon, who reviewed a draft of this, and he talked a little bit about the Shil Tot. When the Shil Tot was talking about, that this was life-saving activity, he said maybe Beit Shammai wasn't as convinced of the permission to do such things and to override the rules as easily, but I think we are. I very much take your point, and that's part of my conclusion. Where at the bottom of this page, not the conclusion. You should only be so lucky. But that it is important to do this visitation. One of the things I think a lot of people worry about is, do you really want to bring up to someone about their loss? Maybe, but what the truth is? At least my experience, and I think the experience of others, is, especially during Shiva, you're not reminding anyone of anything. And to the extent you are, that's going to be their thought 3 seconds from now anyway. And the idea of leaving a person's loss as the elephant in the room, so to speak, I think is really problematic and insensitive. We can maybe debate exactly what to say and how to say it, but certainly the idea that this isn't Shabbistic, really, that's the primary thing I wanted to speak about, and I think you said it very well in that spirit. Yeah.
On Shabbat, if you've been sitting Shiva, you take off your torn garment. I mean, you're supposed not to wear that, so isn't that part of your Shiva?
So yes, Shiva is suspended, and at least public acts of mourning are suspended on Shabbat. And we'll discuss in the next little section if that has any impact on what's permitted in terms of consolation. You're not wearing the garments, but the truth is most people in the community probably know about the loss anyway.
It seems to me that the Gemara, but it's interesting that they did actually state this position of Shammai, and perhaps what they're saying indirectly is that we recognize that most things in life are questions of degree, not of kind, and so that we should perhaps not go with all the burners on Shabbat, but it's okay to visit. Perhaps it should be modified to some degree, because after all, we do have somewhat of a regard for Shabbat. So we have this tension that has to be taken into consideration. That's perhaps why they codified it the way they did.
So it's interesting. I mean, I don't think Beit Shammai's opinion indicates any levels of degree. He just says it's forbidden.
But you see, degree is measured by, you put on a scale and you put a weight. And then you put another weight that's less. So it still goes down, but it's not quite the full.
As a general rule, we don't give too much weight to Beit Shammai. We live in a Beit Hillel world, I would think. But what I would say is, it's interesting, and we'll get into this a little bit further. The Gemara goes on and says, when you visit the sick, here's what you say. For instance, we discussed Shabbat imilis ok. So they say, there you're not going full bore. You're not crying out. It doesn't mention any different words for mourning, and we'll discuss some of the import of that later. But I can hear the argument for some form of trying to ease things up a little bit, and we'll discuss that a little bit further. But I would say we should err on the side of not holding back. At least to be on the safe side. So as I said, I think the ultimate point here is that there is this permission for Nihum Avelim, and I think people should be well aware of that. And when it comes to making Shiva visits, I think there's some interesting things. As you know, we generally don't make Shiva visits on Shabbat. That's the practice. And I think there's probably some good value to that in many situations. In the frenetic pace of Shiva nowadays, I think for many families, that little bit of quiet, being with their family is good and restful and helpful for them on Shabbat. At the same time, I think we should probably move away from like that hard and fast rule and have a sensitivity to say, if we have someone who's in mourning who maybe doesn't have as much family around, or would appreciate a visit for someone, or maybe a close friend who simply can't visit any other time, maybe there is some room, to allow such situations. I would say, if it's someone who wants to visit, they should only do that if they've asked the mourners in advance, and only if they're certain that the mourner will be comfortable declining. You don't want to put them in a bad situation, but I think there is room to allow such things. I think there's also room to allow the mourners some discretion in that regard, to feel comfortable saying to a close friend, would you mind coming by, or something like that, to not feel like you're violating some rule to say, would you come make a visit, because really these things are permissible, especially when they're going to be helpful to the mourner. One of my colleagues at UTJ, Rabbi Jerry Sussman, mentioned the case, for instance, where nowadays people move around during Shiva, and if people might be in one place for Shabbat and may be leaving shortly after Shabbat, and they want the opportunity for people to be able to visit in that community, there might be room to discuss permission for such things. So I'm not deciding any particular rule there. I'm just saying we should be sensitive to the possibility of other practices. So I have two additional sections which I'm going to try to breeze through a little bit. One is the issue of public announcements of mourning on Shabbat. And there's debates like, do you announce at synagogue that someone's passed away? Do you what can you do publicly? We discussed before there is the rule that public mourning is not permitted on Shabbat. So ultimately, and my friend Dov Berger put it this way. So he asked me the question. So does that apply to the mourner only, meaning the mourner can't do anything in public, or does that rule apply also to the consolers, to say they shouldn't do anything of public consoling on Shabbat? And the truth is, even if we said that in theory the public consolation should be a problem on Shabbat, maybe we should say, just as perhaps bekoshi, perhaps with difficulty, they permitted it for individuals, maybe should also be permitted in groups, or the announcement to shul, things like that. The truth is, there are no sources that really directly address this issue. We saw the Ritba earlier, who mentioned kind of matter-of-factly that people don't do Nechama on Shabbat, and publicly it's forbidden. In the Mosar of Kook, the excellent large set of volumes of Ritba, the commentator there, Rabbi Eliyahu Lichtenstein, says, and you see this quote on the top of page 12, we found no source for this, and it's very difficult, and we don't know where it came from. So we don't have much indication, one way or another, of real good hard sources on this question. We do have the story in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer that we mentioned a little bit before, and I'll briefly talk about it. It talks about how Solomon saw how important it was to console mourners and to do milut chasadim in general. And so he set up two doors to the temple. One where people would go if they had gotten married, and the people who were there would celebrate with them. And if someone came through the mourners' gate and mentions that they had certain indicia of mourning, which is interesting, but I'm not going to get too into that. And if they came in as mourners, then they would say to him, "Hashochen b'bayit hazeh yenachemcha." May the the God who dwells in this temple bring you consolation. And then it tells us, once the temple was destroyed, the rabbis instituted that both people who were married and people who had suffered a loss would come to the Beit Knesset and Beit Midrash, and people would see them, and if they saw the mourner, they would sit with them in order to do gmilut chasadim, to do kindness for them. And regarding such people, the mourner would say, Baruch atah Hashem, gomel sachar tov ligomelei chasadim. Blessed are you, Adonai, who bestows a good reward on those who bestow kindness. So it's interesting here, this seems to be a fairly public form of consoling of mourners. Mourners would come through the gate and be seen by whoever was there, and they would be offered consolation by the people who were there. But as we saw from the Alei Tamar, there were different customs out there. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the custom that we see in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is an okay custom, because Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is kind of thing that it's informative, but it's not necessarily considered, as authoritative as, say, the Babylonian Talmud. And if we think that the Babylonian Talmud, by prohibiting public mourning, would prohibit such a thing, then we would probably say that would override the lesson from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. So it's not a strong proof. I have a quote here from Rabbi, who talks about that the reason why, he says about this story, he says, Af al gav de farhesyahu, even though this is in public, mishum mitzvah shane. Because it's a mitzvah to do it, it's okay. Since it's a mitzvah of Nihum Avelim, it's okay to do that publicly. So that's how he reads the precedent of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. He also mentions that he thinks, and I saw a couple of other comments like this, that the whole reason why there was a difficulty in allowing Nihum Avelim on Shabbat was precisely because of its public nature. Because, obviously, if you're doing it, you're talking to someone, there's two people, that's already a public. If he's right about that, then the answer is public acts of Nihum Avelim are permitted, but I'm not sure that's a great strong proof. We have the story of the Rosh on the bottom of page 13. The Rosh says, "V'chein noagim be'Ashkenaz ha'avel holech lebeit ha'knesset." This was the practice in Ashkenaz. The mourner would come to the temple on Shabbat, and after prayers, he would go out of the temple. He would sit, and everyone else would come out to him, and they'd walk home with him, and they'd sit with him for an hour. And that they relied on in order to do this, they relied on the lesson of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. So the Rosh takes the story of Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer to be authoritative and to teach that such public acts of consolation are permitted on Shabbat. The Torah quotes Rosh on this, as the Torahs want to do in general, because that's his father. But the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say one way or another anything about public announcements. On page 14, we discussed already that Gesher HaChaim talks about welcoming people during Kabbalat Shabbat, and he says that's because this Nihum has stops after that, maybe indicating he thinks public announcements shouldn't be made. Clearly, the Mishnah Brura at the bottom of the page, he quotes the Pri Megadim, says, that if someone comes after they said Psalm 92, Shuv lo yikra hashamash, that they should no longer do that welcoming thing. And that's where he says, but nonetheless, private consolation is permitted.
Sorry.
Yes.
Isn't Tisha B'Av the ultimate mourning? And on Tisha B'Av, we don't even greet one another. So how much, if on Tisha B'Av we don't greet one another, I imagine, I know from my own personal experience, when you're mourning, it is a mini personal.
Yeah, and there are restrictions on greeting during when one is in Avelut, one is forbidden from She'ilat Shalom, which there could be different translations of. It means literally the asking of the peace, but probably means something along the lines of either extending pleasantries or extending good wishes and things like that. So there definitely are restrictions that are similar. Of course, on Shabbat, Tisha B'Av doesn't exactly apply either. So the question we're dealing with is, what about Shabbat? So on the subject of public displays of consolation, I think it's honestly a close call, because we have, there's two ways of looking at it. We're not sure. We don't have any really good source on this. Should we say that since public mourning is forbidden, public consolation should be forbidden? We know that the rabbis bent over backwards, so to speak, to permit Nihum Avelim on Shabbat. Should we therefore say we should bend over backwards, and if we're not sure whether or not it's permitted, we should do it, and we should therefore allow public displays of consoling mourners? Or should we say, since it was difficult for the rabbis to allow Nihum Avelim on Shabbat at all, maybe we should say we'll only allow it privately and not publicly? That would be along the lines of the suggestion of tapering it back a little bit. I think ultimately probably the practice of doing whatever we can before Shabbat begins is probably best. So the idea of doing that Nihum right before Kabbalat Shabbat, I think, or before Psalm 92, I think makes some sense. I think we should be careful not to give the wrong signal, that people shouldn't learn from that no Nihum Avelim should be approved on Shabbat. But I think that probably makes sense. But like Shabbos morning, I think it's appropriate for a shul to make an announcement about someone who is bereaved and to wish Nihum on behalf of the congregation. But that's kind of Noah on life. There's I could easily see people making different judgments on that issue. Let me run through quickly the last issue that I wanted to bring up, which is, what do you say to a mourner? Of course, there's general conversation and things like that, but we all know the common greeting for Ashkenazim is Hamakom Yenachem Etchem Betoch She'ar Avelei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May God bring you consolation of the mourners among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And the Sephardim say Tenuchamu min hashamayim. May be consoled from the heavens. And I mentioned the Gemara says when you're visiting the sick, here's different things that different rabbis would say, and we ultimately the halacha talks about saying Shabbat hi miluso kufra karvolavo, but there's no mention of what do you say to a mourner, and you can interpret that in different ways. Maybe they mean you should say nothing. Personally, I think if they wanted you to say nothing, they probably should have mentioned that. Maybe they mean just say whatever you're going to say. It's fine. There's no limitation. Or maybe they mean, well, see what we said about the saying things to sick people, and say a similar thing to people who are in Avelut. So, and I'm going to skip the sources. There's some people who say it's not fine, say whatever you want to say. It's some people who say you should say, for instance, Shabbat hi milenachem unechama krova lavo. The Sabbath holds us back from doing consolation, and you could translate it as consolation will come soon, or may consolation come soon. I'll discuss that a little bit further. So there are different suggestions, to kind of retrofit what we say for someone who's sick and use that to say to mourners. I'm going to get into some problems I have with those phrases.
Can I just ask you?
Yeah.
In South Africa and England, for a mourner, you say, "I wish you long life."
Yes.
You know where that comes from, or how is that related?
I don't, but I did get that from some of my British relatives. So yeah, I don't know the derivation. Toward the bottom, on the bottom of 17, I have the commentary of Rav Yosef Kapach on Rambam, where he mentions one very interesting thing, that Rambam was very, very strict as far as not making requestful or plaintive prayer on Shabbat. And so he mentions there that Rambam understands the statement to the sick person, Urufu'a krova lavo, not to mean may healing come soon, but healing will come soon. So it is a statement of hope and announcement, and not of prayer. And then Rav Kapach goes on and says, similarly, saying Tenuchamu min hashamayim, may you be consoled from heavens, would be a prayer. And I would assume he'd say also with Ashkenazim, to say Hamakam Yenachem Etchem, may God console you, would also be prayerful, and therefore Rambam wouldn't take kindly to that. And what Rav Kapach says is when they visit a mourner, when they arrive, they say Shabbat Shalom, and when they leave, they say Shabbat Shalom. My colleague and teacher, Rabbi Yaakov Siegel, noted to me that Rambam was the strictest on this. And there's lots of things that we do that Rambam wouldn't necessarily approve of. And I have a footnote here. Aruch HaShulchan asks, when we say Yishlach lo refuah shlema in our Mishaberachs on Shabbat, he says that would be really problematic according to him. And he's like, what the heck's it doing in our Sidur? So, yes, Rambam might not like Shabbat hi milenachem, or might not like us saying Hamacham Yenachem Etchem or Minashin Mayim Tenuchamu, but there are probably some more others who would not find that to be a prayer that was problematic. And I would say that also we have, again, we're taking a permissive attitude toward this Nechama in general. Maybe we should take a permissive attitude toward these common phrases that people find very meaningful. So I think there's reason to maybe use those phrases on Shabbat. But if you wanted to substitute and just say, my condolences, I'm sorry, I'm here for you, things like that, I think that work as well. I do want to speak about my concerns for Shabbat hi milenachem u'nechama krov alavo, which is the suggested substitute. And I have a problem with both of those phrases. I have a problem with Shabbat hi milenachem, which means the Sabbath prevents us from consoling, because, as we've seen, the Shabbat does not stop us from consoling. Maybe there are some restrictions. Maybe we have to change what we say a little bit. Maybe we don't do it as publicly. Okay, there's arguments on that. But ultimately, giving Nechama on Shabbat is permitted. And so I don't think we should be using a phrase that might perpetuate a misunderstanding of the halacha at best. And also, I think this comes back to what you said earlier. By the way, I'm not mentioning names to protect the innocent. What you said earlier about, here we're going to say Shabbat, like to say to someone, oh yeah, I'd console you, but it's Shabbat, so I'm not going to. I think maybe not the most sensitive thing to say. So if you wanted to say something fancy, maybe you could say Shabbat hi milizok. Shabbat prevents us from crying out. But then again, I don't think we really cry out on when doing consoling of mourners. So, but that's one thing. And unechama krov alavo, the consolation. So if we read it as unechama krov alavo, meaning may comfort come soon, I'd be okay with that. Rambam wouldn't, because he'd say that's too prayerful on Shabbat and might be too depressing. If we wanted to read Unechama krov alavo like Rambam had read Urefuah krov alavo, it would roughly translate to consolation will come soon. I'd be interested if other people have thoughts of this, but I don't like that at all. I know there's a number of people will say to mourners, you'll feel better soon, you'll get over it, things like that. I find that to be minimizing of a person's loss. So I would encourage people, to the extent possible, not to say something like that. Unless you see someone who, we said earlier, there's always, exceptions. If you see someone who's really struggling and is saying to you, how am I ever going to live? Then maybe saying Unechama krov alavo in that way, to say, eventually you will be able to move on. That might not be a bad idea. But for the general mourner, I think to say effectively, don't worry, you'll get over it, isn't necessarily the best thing to say on Shabbat. So I recommend, ultimately, if you want to use the standard phrases, fine. If you want to say my condolences or something like that, fine. Any further questions. Otherwise, I want to mention to people, if you want, or if you go back home, please share the Facebook video with others if they'd be interested. And feel free to continue to comment on the Facebook video, and I'd love to hear more feedback. Okay, so any other questions or comments, and otherwise I'll give you my parting remarks. So we saw in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer that when the mourner would be consoled, he would say, Baruch atah Hashem, gomel sachar tov legomelei chasadim. Blessed are you, Adonai, who bestows a good reward on those who bestow kindness. So I want to express my thanks to everyone who has done so much over this last while to honor the memory of my father and to support me and our family on this loss with countless visits, cards, donations, phone calls, meals, and also in participating in the shiur in commemoration of my father's shloshim. Shilto tells us that doing these kindness is command yahiv lechaye. It's like giving the person life. For a sick person, that is literally true. That visiting a sick person can literally be life-giving. For a person who's sustained a loss, these kindnesses are maybe in a figurative sense, but no less strongly bringing life to a person, because it helps us remember both the beauty and the meaningful life that we have, even as we mourn the loss of one of the most beautiful and meaningful aspects of our lives. The amount of love and caring that I received from my father was inestimable and irreplaceable. But the love and caring we received from so many people has truly been heartening and life-affirming. I pray that you all know the merit of the Sachar Tov, the good reward that comes with acts of kindness. May my father's memory and the Torah that we learned today in his memory, in the memory of Melvin Gradofsky, Elimelech HaKohen, Ben Freder Zvi, help inspire us and guide us toward earning that reward, but more importantly, toward providing all the comfort and support that we are capable of providing to one another in our times of need. Baruch HaGomel Sachar Tov L'Gomelei Chasadim. Praise be the one who bestows a good reward on those who bestow kindness. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm going to finish the video here and welcome comments in the future on the video. Thanks.